Elias Cobb noticed it before he understood it. The way the hemlock bark along the ridge peeled clean that first week of June, whole sheets of it lifting from the trunk with barely a sound, as though the tree had been waiting all winter to be relieved of its coat. He stood with his hatchet loose in his hand and did not swing it. He only listened. Somewhere under the bark, sap moved like a slow pulse, and when he pressed his palm flat against the trunk he could feel it, faint as a held breath. He had cut hemlock before. It had never come away like this. He did not know yet what it meant. He only knew it was worth remembering. And so that evening, by the light of a tallow lamp that smoked more than it burned, he wrote the date in the margin of an old ledger, June the 4th, and beside it, in his slow and careful hand, "Bark comes easy this week." Ask why? That was the whole of it at first. No storm, no crisis, no name for what was coming. Only a man noting something strange about the land he had been given, the way a farmer notes the flight pattern of geese or the color of a sunset, filing it away against some future use he could not yet name. Elias Cobb had come to the ridge 3 years past, a widower's son on a widower's inheritance, and the land had not been kind in the drawing. When old Ezra Cobb died and the parcel was divided among his sons, the good bottom land went to the elder brothers, black soil, standing pine, a creek that ran clear into October. Elias, the youngest, had drawn the stony shoulder of the ridge, 40 acres of thin soil and second-growth hemlock and white birch, trees too soft and too fast splitting for proper shingles. The other men in the valley had said as much to his face, not unkindly, but plainly, the way men speak of a fact already settled. Poor luck, that ridge. Nothing up there but bark and stone. He had only nodded. He did not argue with facts. He built his cabin low against the wind, married a woman named Sarah who did not seem to mind the poverty of the view, and when it came time to roof the place, he had no pine to spare and no coin to buy shingles hauled up from the mill in the valley. He had bark and stone and whatever his father had known and never fully said aloud before the fever took him. It was Sarah who found the ledger, in truth, not the farming ledger everyone in the valley kept for accounts, but a second book, thinner, its cover gone soft with handling, tucked behind a loose board in the loft where old Ezra had slept his last winters. She brought it down without a word and set it on the table between them, and Elias opened it the way a man opens a door he is not sure he wants to walk through. His father's hand was cramped and older than Elias remembered it, but the words were plain enough. Notes on livestock, a remedy for saddle sores, and then, near the back, a heading that stopped him, on bark for roofing, as my own father showed me, and his before him. There were only 2 pages of it, but 2 pages were enough. Strip in the 2nd and 3rd weeks after the sap rises, never before, never much after. Bark cut too early tears, cut too late will not bend. Lay sheets bark side up, overlapping one course over the next by no less than 1/3 the width of the sheet, else the water finds the seam. Wait fresh-laid bark with river stone for no fewer than 9 days, that it dry flat and not curl from the ridge like a dead leaf. Elias read it 3 times that night, and each time it seemed less like his father's hand and more like his father's voice, low and unhurried. The voice of a man who had never in life explained himself much but had, it seemed, meant to leave something behind for the son who would need it most. He began the work in the 2nd week of June, exactly as the ledger instructed, and for the first 11 days it went as though the land itself were cooperating. He and Sarah's younger brother, a quiet boy named Micah who had come to live with them after his own people passed, stripped sheet after sheet of hemlock and birch bark from the ridge trees, each sheet near 3 feet long and better than 2 feet across, and stacked them to cure beneath a lean-to of split rails. By the time they were done, Elias counted 46 sheets fit for the roof and set 11 more aside as spoiled, cracked from cutting too near a knot or too rough with the draw knife. The laying took 4 days more. Elias worked the ledger's instruction like scripture, overlapping each course by what he judged to be 1/3 of the sheet's width, and when the roof was done he stood back in the yard beside Micah and looked up at it, a rough brown shingling, patched and uneven as a quilt sewn by an unpracticed hand, but whole. The first rain came 9 days later, a hard afternoon shower that turned the yard to mud in an hour. Elias sat inside listening to it drum on the bark overhead, and for a while he believed himself vindicated. Then, Near the northeast corner above the hearth, a thin line of water found its way through and began to drip, slow and steady, into the ash. Sarah said nothing. She only fetched a bucket and set it beneath the drip, and the sound of the water striking tin filled the cabin all through supper, a small persistent clock counting out his failure. He went up the ladder himself the next clear morning to look, Micah steadying the rungs below, and it did not take him long to find the fault. The seam above the hearth had been laid with an overlap he now measured, by a stick notched at careful intervals, to be no more than a hand's width, 4 inches on a sheet near 22 inches across, while short of the third his father's ledger demanded. He had rushed that course, he remembered now, hurrying to finish before the light failed. "You'll tear it all off." Then, Sarah's mother said when she came up from the valley to see the place and found the bucket still sitting by the hearth, the ash gone gray and damp beneath it. She was not a cruel woman, only a frightened one, and her fear came out sideways, the way fear often does. "Bark is no way to keep a family dry, Elias. Everyone from here to the mill roofs in shingle or shake. There's a reason for it. There's a reason my roof leaks in one seam and not 40 others," Elias said, mild as ever. "That reason is mine, not the bark's." He relayed the faulted course alone, cutting a new sheet wider by 6 inches to give the overlap room, and this time he measured it against the notched stick before setting a single stone to weight it. When the next rain came, a full week of it in the first days of July, the northeast corner held dry, and the bucket stayed empty in the corner where Sarah had left it, a small monument to the mistake he did not intend to repeat. He wrote it in the ledger that night, in the fresh pages he had begun to keep alongside his father's, July 6th. Overlap corrected to near 1/2 width above hearth. Dry through 6 days of rain. Note, my father's third was a minimum, not a rule to shave close. The drought came on so slowly that no one in the valley could say afterward exactly which week it began. It was simply that June's rains did not return in July, and July's dry spell did not break in August, and by the 3rd week of August the creek that fed the valley's good bottomland had thinned to a trickle a man could step across without wetting his boot. Elias began to keep count, not out of dread, at first, but out of the same habit that had made him write down the ease of stripping bark in June, a farmer's instinct to measure what could be measured, since so little else could be controlled. He marked the well's depth on a stick notched at the waterline, 11 feet down on the 14th of August, 13 feet down by month's end. He counted the flour barrels in the cellar, 4 full, 1/2, and reckoned, at the rate Sarah baked, they would see the family through to the first frost and little beyond, unless the harvest came in better than the parched fields now promised. The heat did something else to the valley besides drying the creek. It dried the wood. Elias saw it first on the Hensley place, 2 miles down the ridge road, split shingle roofing, good pine, laid by a careful hand years before, now curling at the edges like paper held too near a fire, the wood gone brittle and gray with the drought's long thirst. He saw the same on the Pruitt barn, on the smithy's shed behind Garrick's forge, on the little chapel roof where Reverend Whitfield's wife kept the Sunday cloths dry, or tried to. Pine wants water in its grain the way a man wants water in his throat, and a summer with none left the whole valley's shingling brittle as kindling, waiting on some blow to finish what the drought had started. Bark, Elias began to notice, did not dry the same way. It cracked less. It did not curl. Whether that was some virtue in the bark itself or merely luck, he could not yet say, and he was careful, in his own mind, not to claim more than he knew. It was near the end of August that the doubt came for him in earnest, and it came not as an argument from outside, but as a quiet, private erosion, the kind that eats a man's confidence the way water eats a stream bank, unseen until the bank gives way all at once. He stood in the yard one evening with Sarah, looking up at his own roof, 46 sheets of bark, patched and repatched, still holding after weeks of heat that had cracked half the valley's shingling, and instead of pride, he felt only a cold uncertainty settle into him. What if the dry season had merely spared him, and not because of anything he had done? What if the bark, too, would fail, later, worse, when he had less time to mend it? "I ought to strip it all and start again with shake," he said to Micah the next morning, already reaching for the ladder. "Do it right, before the weather turns." Micah did not argue with him. The boy rarely spoke more than he needed to. He only stepped between Elias and the ladder, quiet and immovable as a fence post, and pointed, not at the roof, but at the bucket in the corner of the cabin, the one that had sat empty since the 6th of July. Dry, Micah said. One word. He said it again, softer. Dry since you fixed it. Elias looked at the bucket a long while. Then he looked at the ledger open on the table, at his own hand recording 7 weeks of dry, seams beside the one line where he had failed and corrected it. The proof had been sitting in front of him the whole time, plain as the empty bucket, and it had taken a boy of few words to make him see it again. He did not climb the ladder that day. He went back to the ledger instead, and beneath the last entry he wrote, August 29th. Nearly undid good work from fear of what I hadn't yet seen. Micah stopped me. Remember, the bucket does not lie, even when the sky does. The dog noticed the storms before anyone else did. That was the plain truth of it, though it took the valley some while to trust an animal's judgment over its own eyes. Elias's dog, a rangy brindle bitch named Tansy who had never in 3 years shown much interest in the weather, began in early September to pace the yard in the hour before dusk, ears low, tail tucked, refusing to settle even when called. The horse, too, a sway-backed gelding Elias had traded 2 hogs for the previous spring, grew skittish in his stall on the evenings before the sky turned strange, stamping and blowing at nothing a man could see. The first hailstorm came on the 9th of September, a Tuesday, and it announced itself the way such storms often do, a greenish cast to the western sky, a stillness in the air so complete that even the flies seemed to have gone to ground, and then, within the space of 20 minutes, stones the size of a man's thumbnail falling in sheets that stripped the last of the drought-starved corn to ribbons. It lasted 11 minutes by Elias's own count, watch in hand, and when it passed he climbed to check his roof and found 3 sheets of bark cracked at the edges, but none breached through. He noted it, September 9th, hail 11 minutes, roof holds, 3 sheets to patch, and thought, for one evening, that the worst of it might be over. It was Otis Kellerman, the miller, who came to his door first, 2 days after that storm, hat in hand, and a look on his face that Elias had not seen there before. The mill roof, good cedar shake laid by a craftsman 20 years past, now dry and brittle from the summer's drought, had taken the hail like a man taking a beating he had no strength left to answer. Water was coming through above the grinding floor, threatening the last of the season's flour stores. I don't come to you easy, Elias, Otis said, turning his hat by the brim. Man my age asking a young fellow like you for roofing advice. But your place stood, and mine's letting in the sky, and I've maybe 2 barrels of good flour left before the whole valley's hungry for one of a working mill. Elias took him up to see the bark roof, showed him the overlap measured against the notched stick, the waiting stones still holding the courses flat along the ridge. He did not lecture. He only answered what was asked, the way his father's ledger had answered him. Strip while the sap still moves, not after, he said. Lay it heavy over each seam, more than you'd think needed. Weight it down and leave it be. It isn't magic. It's only patience, done right the first time. The second visitor came a fortnight later, after a smaller hailfall on the 23rd of September had done less damage generally, but had found, with cruel precision, the one weak corner of the chapel roof. Ruth Whitfield, the Reverend's wife, arrived at Elias's door in the gray hour before full light, her shawl soaked through from walking the 2 miles in a light rain that had followed the hail. The Lord's house is leaking on the altar cloth, she said, with the particular exhaustion of a woman who has been up all night moving buckets, and I have heard, Mr. Cobb, that yours is not. He went with her that same morning, Micah driving the wagon loaded with bark sheets cut and cured that spring beyond what his own roof had needed, a surplus he had kept, without quite admitting to himself why, against some use he had not yet named. They patched the chapel roof in a day and a half, and when the next rain came, light but steady, the altar cloth stayed dry. The third came in October, after the worst hailstorm of the season had passed through on the 4th, stones larger than any before, some near the size of a hen's egg, falling for 19 minutes and leaving not a single shingle roof in the lower valley untouched. Garrick the blacksmith, a broad, silent man Elias had exchanged perhaps 20 words within 3 years, arrived at dusk leading his own horse, which had gone lame from a stone that had struck it in the open pasture where no shelter had reached in time. He did not ask for help with words. He simply stood in the yard, looking up at the bark roof, whole and unbreached after a storm that had staved in his forge sheds, shingling entire, and waited. "I've bark enough cured for one more roof this year," Elias said. "Yours, if you'll have it." Garrick nodded once, and that was the whole of the conversation, and it was enough. By the middle of October, the valley's tally had settled into a grim sort of arithmetic that everyone had come, by necessity, to understand. 12 homes and outbuildings had taken serious damage from the season's hail, roofs staved through, grain spoiled. One barn's rafters cracked under the accumulated weight of ice before it could melt. Elias's own roof, 46 sheets laid in June and patched twice since, had taken damage to no more than 5 sheets across 4 separate storms, each patched within a day of the fall. The well, too, had told its own story. It had bottomed near 14 feet in the driest week of September, and Elias had begun, without telling Sarah at first, to reckon what they would do if it failed entirely. How many days the last half-barrel of flour might stretch, how far he would need to haul water from the thinned creek below. He had written the numbers down because writing them down was the only comfort he had against them. But the well had held, just barely, and the flour had lasted, just barely. And by the time the October rains finally broke the drought in earnest, soaking the valley in 3 days of steady, ordinary weather, the worst of the reckoning had passed without quite arriving. Sarah's mother came again in late October, walking up the ridge road on a morning gone crisp with the year's first real cold, and she stood in the yard looking at the bark roof for a long while before she spoke. "I said this was no way to keep a family dry," she said finally. "You did," Elias agreed. "I was wrong to say it so plain. I was afraid for you and Sarah, up here with nothing but bark and stone, and I let the fear speak instead of my sense." She looked at him, and something in her face had softened past what pride alone could account for. "Otis tells it different now, down at the mill. Says half the valley means to strip bark come next June, if you'll show them how." "I'll show whoever asks," Elias said. "It isn't a secret. It only takes longer than most men want to give it." Through November, as the harvest came in thinner than any man in the valley could recall, but not so thin as the driest fears had painted, Elias kept the ledger going, and its pages had changed character without his quite intending it. What had begun as a private record, dates of bark stripping, measurements of overlap, the slow accounting of a well's depth and a flour barrel's weight, had become, by the season's end, something closer to an instruction left for others, the way his father's 2 pages had once been left for him. He wrote out the full method in a clean hand on fresh paper, meaning to leave it where Otis, or Ruth, or Garrick, or whoever else came asking next spring, might find it and follow it without having to learn each correction the hard way he had. Strip in the 2nd and 3rd weeks after the sap rises. Lay each course over the last by near 1/2 its width, not less, though my father's ledger said 1/3 would serve. Mine did not, until I widened it. Wait with Riverstone 9 days at the least, longer does no harm. Expect one failure. Correct it plainly, and do not tear out good work for fear of what has not yet happened. Watch the bucket, not the sky. By the 1st week of December, snow had begun to fall on the ridge in the ordinary way of winters there, and Elias climbed the ladder one last time before the cold set in hard, to check the bark against the coming season. It held tight under his hand, dry and sound, the stones still weighting the ridge courses as they had since June. Below in the yard, Micah was mending a fence rail, unhurried as always, and Tansy lay in a patch of thin winter sun with her ears finally at ease, and the horse stood calm in its stall for the first evening in longer than Elias could easily recall. Sarah came to the door and called him down to supper, and he came, climbing down slow, the ladder's rungs cold under his palms. That night he made the last entry of the year in the ledger, beneath all the months of careful counting, the well's depth, the flour's weight, the storms timed by his father's old watch, the 3 separate men who had come to his door across the autumn, each needing what he had learned to give. He wrote only this: December 3rd, roof sound, well recovered to 9 feet. Flour enough, with care, to spring. It was never the bark alone that held. It was giving the work the whole of its proper time, and not 1 hour less, however much the waiting cost. He closed the book and set it on the shelf beside his father's, the 2 ledgers standing together now, one hand's work continuing the other's, and outside the first real snow of the season came down slow and even over the ridge, settling without hurry on a roof that had already, in its own unhurried way, seen the valley through.